Imagine you're George Russell in the Belgian Grand Prix. You cook up this brilliant strategy of pulling off a one-stopper and you do it. You beat your 7-time world champion in equal machinery, doing the impossible, and then you get disqualified from the race. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, but that's your Belgian Grand Prix. I mean, who is the scriptwriter that F1 has hired for the 2024 season? Last week we had drama within the race. This week we had drama even after the race ended. Of course, I'm going to talk about what exactly happened that led to this disqualification, but there are a lot of things to unpack at the Belgian Grand Prix, and something new might happen at Red Bull very soon as well. So let's talk about it. I want to talk about the race start. Of course, Verstappen qualified on pole, but because he was taking a new engine, he had a 10 place grid penalty, so he was starting from P11. So the starting grid was Leclerc, Perez, Hamilton, and so on. Hamilton got a crazy good start and he almost caught Perez napping, and he was already on him, already was in P2 by the time we came to the first turn. Perez tried to fight back, but unfortunately Hamilton was crazy good at the race start and he held P2, and because all of this squabbling was going on behind, Leclerc was safe in P1 and he was able to continue without any big challenge. While this was happening, Lando Norris as usual messed up the start once again and ended up losing a couple of positions, 3 if I'm not wrong. And it was just a disaster for him. He went wide. He said in the post interview as well that he's consistently making mistakes and he should work on it. Either it's the start or either it's some mistake here or there. You could see him going wide and he just wasn't there at the race start. And within 2 laps, Verstappen, who started in P11 and Norris, who started in P4, were next to each other. That's how good Max's opening laps were. And on lap 3, you could see this really cool move by Hamilton on Leclerc, and then Hamilton settled into the lead of the race and he was handling the pace comfortably. Do you know an interesting thing? Mercedes did bring in a couple of upgrades for the W15, but before the qualifying, they took all of these updates out. So this was the non-updated version. Somehow the updates didn't give a good impression on Friday and they were nowhere, so they just decided to remove them to avoid any confusion. Then they did a lot of work on the simulator, worked on the setup, changed the setup completely for the qualifying. They couldn't test that in the third practice session because it was rainy, but regardless, whatever changes they did worked really well because Mercedes was undoubtedly one of the strongest cars of this race, because Hamilton was comfortably keeping a gap to the people behind and he was able to control the race well. 2 technical things that you should know which would explain the race a lot better. Number 1, the tire degradation was not as heavy as teams would have expected. The track was resurfaced last year. Maybe that had to do something with it, or the temperatures, because the tires were not degrading as easily. And the second thing was that it was very difficult to overtake in dirty air, and the clean air advantage was a lot in this track. Clean air is basically you don't have anyone in front of you for a couple of seconds, but as soon as you're within 1 or 2 seconds of someone, that dirty air starts to affect your pace. That was exactly what was happening, because you could see a lot of people close the gap quickly. I mean, Verstappen closed the gap to Norris, later on Norris closed the gap to Verstappen, but they just couldn't overtake because of all of the dirty air. So the dirty air was very powerful here, and they had also shortened one of the DRS zones because the overtaking was very easy last year. Around lap 11, lap 12, you saw Russell, Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc pitting and changing from medium tires to hard tires. McLaren decided to pit Piastri first, and Piastri actually was one of the fastest man on the track, because in fact I think the McLaren had a better race pace than Mercedes, because Piastri's last stint was so much faster than that of the Mercedes, and McLaren still definitely has a car advantage. And Piastri is just an amazing guy. I mean, he has these one-liners while driving. He said something like clean air is king if nobody's told you, and he's a very funny character, and at the same time he has the pace to show on track. He does not crumble under pressure, he doesn't make as many mistakes, and he in fact was one of the best drivers in this race. If it wasn't for his mistake at the pit stop where he sort of hit the guy ahead, and because of that his pit stop was slow, he would actually have enough pace to fight for the win, because he was around 2 seconds behind, and that extra 2 seconds was because of that pit stop. So he would have potentially won the race as well. Piastri definitely had an edge on Norris during the race. Norris made a couple of mistakes while driving. The strategy was not very optimal as well, but still he just didn't show enough pace as Piastri, and that does not bode well for the championship fight, because even though Max has not won the previous couple of races, he has still ended up extending his lead in the championship battle. I think it's just that downward spiral mentally as well that Lando has been in. I mean, you see his post-race interviews after the recent races and he's always so disappointed in himself, so sad, So I hope that this summer break that you have now, a couple of weeks time, he can go and re-energize himself and reset himself, that mentality, so that he can once again try to attack in the championship battle. I was also a bit surprised by Red Bull's handling of the race. I mean, Max did have pace and he started in P11, finished in P4 after Russell's penalty. So that was a good race from him, good strategy. He did a medium hard, medium tire strategy, and Checo's pace was nowhere there. And instead, I think he ended up affecting Max in some or the other place, because if you see from lap 15 to lap 21, there was a DRS train where you had Perez, then you had Russell, and then you had Verstappen. So Russell was not able to overtake Perez, and because of that, Verstappen was not able to overtake Russell, and Max was just killing his tires behind Russell in his DRS. So maybe if Red Bull would have asked Sergio to, step aside and let both of them pass, Max would have probably been able to, make a lot more ground. He maybe would have finished 1 or 2 positions ahead, but honestly, I mean, you can't do that to the driver. Why would you ruin Perez's race? But I just thought that maybe because of the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull would have potentially done that. But eventually, Russell did make way through Perez. And then once again, for a lap, Max was stuck behind Perez. Then Red Bull pitted Perez. They only made him do like around 10 laps on the medium stint. And then he went on to the hard tire. And then in the last stint of his hard tires, his pace was nowhere there. So you might think that Red Bull is not giving Perez the favorable strategy, or they are prioritizing Max and things like that, but he didn't show the pace at all. He started in P2, fell all the way back, and he's just not fast enough. Even in the post-race interview, the Red Bull faculty was not happy with his performance. I mean, imagine your driver went from P2 to P7, while the other driver went from P11 to P4. I was honestly a bit too optimistic with my prediction that Max would win this race, because he's won it in even more worse places at this track from P12, P14 or something like that. So I thought he can manage it, but clearly that domination advantage that they had with their car is not there anymore. And that brings me to the whole Mercedes situation. So by the time everybody did their second pit stop, Leclerc went and did a pit stop. Mercedes reacted to it because you have to. Why would you risk a race when Lewis was completely controlling the race pace and he had this win in the back? So they had to do what they had to do. There was no point in risking a one-stop strategy. Whereas Russell on lap 31 was like, why don't we try a one-stop strategy? He probably would have noticed that the tires are not degrading that much and it is very difficult to make an overtake in the dirty air. So he went with this suggestion, and Mercedes also said that according to their simulations, if they would have pitted Russell, the best position he would have ended up in is P5. And if they didn't pit him and his tires completely fell off at the end of the race, the worst position he would be was P5. So why not take the gamble? And that's what they did. Everyone assumed Lewis Hamilton was quickly going to overtake Russell because he had much fresher tires and he was closing the gap rapidly, and that's what he did. Within a couple of laps, he was within touching distance of Russell, but as soon as he came within that 1 second of Russell, remember, dirty air, pace falling down, that's what happened, and you could see the lap times. They were not faster than Russell and he couldn't make his way past, and Russell ended up winning the race. Funnily, Hamilton did suggest a one-stop strategy for himself, but the team was like, no, that's way too risky, because he was telling Oscar in the cool-down room that every time I pitted, I had more grip in the tires. I could have gone longer, but the team said no, and Lewis was like, I put my trust in the strategist, that's what you're supposed to do. They should have probably informed me that Russell is going to do this, so I could have, played it accordingly. But whatever it was, the gamble had more reward in terms of Russell. It didn't have more reward in terms of Lewis, which is why they didn't go with that. Because imagine if they would have pulled a one-stopper with Lewis and something like this that happened with George would have happened. Or maybe his tires would have fell off. Then they would look fools because they had the win in the bag. So Russell P1, Hamilton P2, Piastri P3. It's a good and happy podium. Everybody celebrated. And within an hour, you get this notification that Russell's car is under scrutiny because it is below the minimum weight. What is minimum weight in Formula 1? So basically all of the F1 cars are weighed after the race, after draining their fuel. So all of the fuel is removed and the cars are weighed, and they have to be of a certain weight. I don't exactly remember the number. I think it's 789 kgs or something. I'm going to write it here. And that's done for safety. So all of the cars should at least be of this weight. Anything lower than this is not acceptable. So Russell's car was 1.5 kg less than this acceptable weight, and that's why his car was disqualified. Like I told you, on Friday, Mercedes tested a couple of parts, then removed them and put the old parts in. And when the car does not meet the minimum weight, F1 teams add this thing, what is called a ballast, to add that extra weight. So maybe Russell's side of the garage did a small error in the calculation, and that's why the car was already underweight when they started the whole race. And when the car is underweight, it wears down the tires less and you are slightly faster over the course of race distance. If his car was 1.5 kg underweight, then he would have gotten an advantage anywhere between 2 to 3 seconds. So yeah, maybe that's why he was able to keep that pace. Another explanation was that he probably started off with the right weight, but because he pulled a one-stopper strategy, a lot of rubber was worn out of his tires. And of course, if more and more rubber is worn out of the tire, you will lose weight, right? And usually on other tracks, you have one lap that you go around the circuit after the race has ended. And at that times, you might have heard the engineers telling the drivers, pick up rubber, pick up rubber. So basically, they try to drive on these rubber pieces so that they stick to the tire and they add extra weight. According to the estimations, you can add 300 to 400 grams per tire in this lap after the race. So probably that could also be an explanation of why Russell was underweight, because you could not do that in the Belgian Grand Prix. You directly had to go into the pit lane and that's where it ended. There was no lap around the circuit to pick up rubber. But then teams already knew about this and they put this in the calculations because there were other teams as well who pulled off a one-stop strategy and they did not have this problem. So it was basically a computational error by Mercedes, and rules are rules. If you break them, especially these minimum weight requirements and things like that, you are instantly disqualified. Kind of sucks that you go from 25 points to directly 0 points. I mean, it's got a really sting, but then you can't argue with the rules. Let's quickly talk about Ferrari. So they had a decent pace. They had to roll back to their previous edition of the car for the Belgian Grand Prix, but they did bring some circuit specific updates. So they got their bouncing in control, which was a major concern on a high speed track like this. So that is good. That is some progress. Leclerc had decent pace. I mean, he held on well and eventually got a podium because of Russell's disqualification. And Sainz, the strategy did not work out. They went with an alternate strategy where he was on the hard tires and then everybody else was on mediums, but that bet did not work out. And the other people who finished in the points were Alonso and Ocon and Daniel Ricciardo, because he eventually ended up in the points because of Russell's disqualification. Then there is nothing noteworthy to talk about the teams at the bottom. I mean, nothing special really happened with either of them. So that was basically your Belgian Grand Prix. Honestly, this season has been an absolute banger and I just cannot wait for the second half of it. Imagine if 2024 is so good, how good 2025 can be. As of now, I still do think that Verstappen is going to end up winning the World Championship, because the problem is that even though he's not winning races, he's not won the last couple of races, the people behind him keep exchanging positions. Sometimes Norris wins, sometimes it's Russell, sometimes it's Hamilton, sometimes it's Piastri. Because of that, nobody has been able to close that gap properly to Max, and because of that initial races of Red Bull domination, he has enough cushion in the World Championship points. But yeah, that Constructors Championship, I feel McLaren is probably gonna win it. It depends now if Red Bull picks another driver. If they pick Daniel, how comfortable is he in that Red Bull? How is he going to perform? Then that could be an interesting battle. Maybe that could go down to the last race. That would be really cool. But this is how things stand right now. We don't really know who's going to be the faster car in the next race. And that's the beauty of F1. That mystery is really cool. And that makes every single race interesting. What are your thoughts about the Belgian Grand Prix? Let me know in the comments. And what are you going to do in summer break because there's no F1? How are you going to cope with it? I'm probably thinking to start a game of F1 Manager and make videos about it on this channel. So if you want it, let me know in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. For more updates, always follow my F1 page, your F1 guy on Instagram. You'll get everything there. Like this video if you liked it. Press the dislike button twice if you didn't like it, and I'm gonna catch up with you guys in another video very soon.